I found both the talks really interesting, but I want to push the speakers and other people to try to connect some of the discussion of Latin America to some of the main themes of the conference we're having this weekend. Because to me, the central reason why we're having this conference is to discuss the period that comes after the period which the book Revolutionary Rehearsals describes, namely the period after 1981. And one of the things that characterises that period is really the absence of independent expressions of workers' power, even in embryonic form, in the kind of revolutionary upheavals that have taken place. The reason why Latin America is very important is that you have seen explosions of popular struggle in which some kinds of, I suppose, embryonic organs of popular power have been said to emerge. So you have the Oaxaca Commune in Mexico, you have the various experiments in popular power in Venezuela, you have the role of the neighbourhood committees in Bolivia in 2003 in Alto, in 2003-2005. These seem to be very, very, very important bodies that are driven from below by popular struggle, but they don't seem to have the same kind of relationship to the working class that the kind of bodies that are described in the book Revolutionary Rehearsals describes. So the first question is, I'd like to press the speakers and other people to explore the strengths and weaknesses of those kind of bodies. The second thing is about something that Alex mentioned yesterday, which is to do with the primacy of politics, because Mike mentioned Hart and Negri and Holloway and autonomism, but certainly in the case of Bolivia, there seems to be a much more long-standing problem here, because if you look at the revolutionary forces, it's quite interesting if you look at Bolivia, because I've read a little bit about the various Bolivian struggles over the last 50 or 60 years. One of the things that strikes you is that for all that you come to expecting to see there being very powerful Trotskyist forces, the actual numerical strength of these kind of forces is quite small. You're talking about a few hundred, a couple of thousand people. And at critical points over the last 50 or 60 years, it seems the struggle has failed to form any kind of political instrument capable of driving the revolution forwards. And at that point, other forces, particularly in the case of Bolivia, popular nationalist forces, both in the 1952 revolution and more recently in the shape of the MAS, have stepped in and transmitted that popular energy from below into electoral channels. It seems a quite long-standing problem, and I think it's something that we have to include in the discussion and debate. So I'd like to pose those two questions, which try and generalise the question of Latin America to some of the general themes of the conference.
Okay, right, three quick things. First of all, practical point. It was raining very heavily on the roof just then, so it's important speakers keep their mouth quite close to the microphone, because otherwise I have to strain my ears. I'm sorry, Mike, you weren't quite doing that all the time, so I had to strain my ears a bit to hear what you were saying. So just to make that note. The other thing, to go back to the politics. Quick question on the Colombia thing, because I wasn't quite sure what you were describing there, Mike. Were you saying that Chavez had a deal with FARC, which then broke, and then made a deal with the Colombian government? Is that what you were saying? Because I didn't quite get what you were saying. And the brokered. Okay, never mind. I'll get on from Mike. The third point concerning the influence of Holloway and the autonomists. When I was hearing you, Mike, when you heard you describe what was going on in terms of how the regimes in Latin America, the Bolivarian regimes were behaving and how they were developing. At the risk of sounding like some kind of rote market, it sounded like the classic situation where there is a popular movement, the reformists take over and then betray the movement. And that would probably have happened without the influence of autonomism anyway, because there isn't any kind of revolutionary force in those countries which could have provided an alternative vision anyway. But maybe that's a bit too simplistic.
I hope I'm speaking clearly into the microphone. I also wanted to connect up with the broader themes that have, some of the broader themes that have emerged in this conference. I mean, two very, very interesting presentations. The first point I wanted to make is that Jeff, in his forthcoming article in International Socialism, but also Mike in his talk now, emphasise the importance of what Jeff calls extractive capitalism in contemporary Latin America, the way in which economy after economy is being restructured and reoriented, producing different kinds of natural resources for the global market, natural gas, different kinds of agricultural goods, and so on and so forth. Now, I think that's interesting because it relates to a question that Mike Haynes raised yesterday about when we see these new forms of political struggle developing, what sort of scope does capitalism have to absorb and accommodate those struggles from an economic point of view? And in many of the economies that we're talking about outside the centre, to the extent that they've been able to enjoy economic growth, it's through feeding the Chinese boom. Again, in the case of South Africa, we've been talking about strikes in industries like platinum against mineral extractive industries. These are economies, and this is true of South Africa as well as the Latin American cases, that have been lifted up by feeding the Chinese boom. Now, that's produced a wave of growth that is one strand in the very complex picture of the unfolding global crisis. But the Chinese boom itself seems to be something that is increasingly fragile and liable, if not to collapse, at least to a very serious slowdown. So that if that is what develops, that will greatly restrict the scope for the room for manoeuvre for capital in many parts of the world. That's one point I wanted to make. Second point is a question that I raised with Jeff after I read a book of his that hasn't been mentioned, but is a very important book, Red October, which is about the two great waves of struggle in 2003-2005. And it's a very, very interesting and important book, because this is one of the great high points of struggle. Before the Arab revolutions, Bolivia 2003-2005 were the real high points that we could refer to. Now, what I said to Jeff was that he describes very well the scale and self-organisation of these struggles, which I agree with Joseph, it's one of my personal heresies, raises questions about the forms that mass self-organisation and dual power will take in contemporary circumstances. But yet the end of the story is that the mass comes to power, and doesn't just come to power in 2006. Morales is re-elected with a larger majority in 2011. How is it able to pull off that trick? And I haven't had a satisfactory explanation either from Jeff or Mike. The parallel with the PSUV in Venezuela doesn't work, because the PSUV was created after Chavez was in power and on the back of his enormous popularity. If this is a party that is rapidly populated with opportunist refugees from the established parties, how is it able to get such a grip on the Bolivian masses? It's clearly not like the case that we talked about last, South Africa, where you have, particularly through COSATU, but also the youth congresses, the different kinds of township organisations, the development of a very dense organised network of activists that has bound the ANC to the South African masses. It doesn't sound at all like that. So how was it that the mass was so able so quickly politically to hegemonise the mass movement and to take Bolivia in the direction of what Jeff calls reconstituted neoliberalism? This is a very important question. If the primacy of politics is something that we have always to have as a reference point when we approach great mass struggles, in other words, how those struggles define themselves in relation to the state and the stake of state power, then it's important to understand how this movement was captured by a force of restoration, if you like, even if reformed restoration, so quickly.
It's really very similar set of questions that came into my mind, and I wanted to know more about the degree to which in any of these cases, there were, if you like, real attempts at redistribution of any of the wealth of the country to be able to absorb some of these movements. Because I think that's what you seem to be saying, that there were, the movements did succeed in forcing some kind of redistribution of wealth to a certain extent. And that seems to me that's very different to the classic project of neoliberalism. Now, maybe it's a temporary thing, something that was forced from below. And following on from Alex's point, how far is that conditional on particular commodities? And for example, the role of oil production in particular in the case of Venezuela. The other question was in relation to the state, because you said that you said that in a sense the state was largely unchanged. I'd like to know a bit more about that, because obviously again this is a kind of crucial process that what happens to the state in revolution and what happens when popular movements from below, by various means. And the interesting thing in the Latin American cases is the combination of the mass struggles from below, strikes, elections, and how they work and weave together in order to produce these changes. But to what happened to what proportion of the existing state functionaries are still there, and how does that relate to them? How does that relate to the rest of the bourgeoisie, to the rest of these countries? Are they sitting there with the state oil companies and saying, we'll come to an agreement where we'll create a new stable alliance with people who are sensible enough to give us something, and we may make concessions on an economic level while we can, in order to then smooth the path back to managing accumulation in our best interests? Or what kind of conflicts and so on broke out in that? I realise there's a large number of cases that you're talking about, but I think those are quite important to understanding the dynamics of what's going on.
I suppose I have a question about to what extent we can understand the dynamic of construction of a regional bloc in Latin America beyond what's happening in the countries where popular movements have forced a change in government, such as Bolivia, Venezuela and Ecuador, to what's happening in the region as a whole. I mean, to pick up on some of the examples mentioned, we can't understand the Tipnis conflict without the role of the Brazilian National Bank and Brazilian government. The example of Chavez's role in relation to the Colombian government brokering the deal with FARC and things, and even just the fact that the Colombian government is more likely to be critical of the US now than it was a few years ago. It seems that the way in which the left governments are positioning themselves in Latin America is increasingly not antagonistic to others, and that the way in which the extractive capitalism, the sort of booms that are reliant on exports to China, as Alex has said, and to other countries, is there an extent to which that's forging a sort of regional capitalist bloc that provides a bit of legitimacy almost and stability to the projects these governments are carrying out, not to sort of over-egg it, but in a similar way, I suppose, to which the USSR could have played a role in other countries in the past. And I mean, if that is the case, obviously, as Alex has pointed out, it's something that will be very fragile because of the fact that the boom in China is itself fragile. But I suppose, to what extent is that something that's a game changer with regards to previous decades, and also sort of on the regional level? I mean, if we see things like that, I think some of the struggles that have started to emerge in the current period in countries that are still enjoying economic booms can be an interesting glimpse, I think, into the possibilities. I mean, they're not as exciting a group potentially as Bolivian tin miners, but the Peruvian teachers have currently been fighting an ongoing strike for a wage increase that is an offensive rather than defensive demand. And I think, there's the Quebec, not Quebec, that's the other end of the Americas, the Chilean students whose struggle has obviously been very inspiring. To what extent can these struggles that we're seeing now in the continent more broadly prefigure, I suppose, what happens when the Chinese boom runs out? It's a convoluted question I was getting to.
I would just like to ask a quick question on the economic cooperation across Latin American countries, because I would be interested in hearing more on the Banco del Sur and the free trade agreements between different Bolivarian, like countries from the Bolivarian Alliance. Because I'm mainly like doing research on the Eurozone, so and I understand that this economic cooperation has been partly inspired by the Eurozone. So I guess my interest is, how is this cooperation, like how intense is this cooperation going to be, and what scale? Like, can we expect that actually to intensify in the context of the current crisis, or is it something that is more likely, and could, or if it intensifies, could it like strengthen the respective states, or could it like increase the class contradictions within and across these states?
Pick up something that Alex was talking about yesterday morning, when he talked about the way in which the class composition, in a sense, the nature of the working class has changed since, if you like, from the 1930s through to the 1980s, and then the situation today. Because it impacts very much on what sense we can make of the possibilities in places like Bolivia and elsewhere. Because we have, I don't want to talk about, in a sense I'm going to say something further about this in the next session, but the question, in a sense, it seems to me there is a question about whether the nature of the revolutionary subject is changing with the developments in capitalism. The smaller size of workplaces, for example, there was a kind of image of socialist revolution being centered on, I don't know, the River Rouge plant in Detroit or Cutillo or whatever. And when you look at what Jeff was telling us about Bolivia, first of all, he describes the destruction of the heart of the Bolivian labor movement in the destruction of the tin miner, the defeat of the tin miners in 1985, which in terms of its impact on Bolivia was much more important than the defeat of the miners in Britain. And yet, 15 years later, you have what he describes as a revolutionary epoch, 5 years from 2000 to 2005, which is not based any longer on massive workplaces, on big workplaces, concentrated workforces. Rather, you have workforces who look like the sorts of populations that, I've forgotten the name of the author, Mike Davis talks about in Planet of Slums. Workers who were working in micro workplaces, obviously, often, and so on. And the basis of the movement is shifted to a quite different kind of pattern of organisation. And so that's a kind of question, it seems to me, about whether we need to, in a sense, to partly rethink the image, indeed, of what we mean by Soviet government or something like that. That's a question. But I also want to pick up. It doesn't seem to me that that's a question about defeat at all, because there's something else in that picture, and I thank Alex for this observation in the meeting I did at Marxism, that actually one sector of workers is still very important, even in these cases, which are people who work in the public sector. The role of teachers, for example, in the Bolivian movement. You can think of the role of public sector workers in South Africa, and go on and on. Public sectors still survive, and they actually are involve large conglomerations of workers, and they obviously play a very significant role in contemporary movements, and that's also true, of course, in Britain. Then, lastly, I want to shift focus slightly, because somebody asked the question, why should we care about Holloway and Hart and Negri, and so on? Because there's a fascinating debate, which, if you Google socialist worker, which you gloriously can do, you go onto the socialist worker site and you do the search on socialist worker, and you can go back and you can look up, type in Bolivia, and go back to 2005, and you find the report of an absolutely fascinating discussion by Bolivian militants in the aftermath of the second movement, the removal of the second president. They've beaten the second president. The question which they're facing is, so what do we do now? We've twice got rid of a president we don't like, so where do we go from here? They don't have an answer to the question, but the question is posed with wonderful clarity in that meeting. What do we do now? And it's a question for the left. It's not a question for the hot, it's a question for those who are the thinking voices of the left. And if Hart and Negri are there, and Holloway are there, they don't have an answer at all. Because the autonomists do not have an answer in terms of posing the question of we must find our own way of taking power as the people. And that's missing, and therefore the question of the impact of the Holloways and the autonomists and the Harts and Negris on the imaginations of the left of the world is actually very, very important, because one of the formative experiences, politically formative experiences of my life just then, was thinking about the experience of Solidarity in Poland. And what did the leading militants in Solidarity say? We mustn't take power. We mustn't think about taking state power. We mustn't threaten the state. Because actually, in the end, if you say we mustn't take power, you can say we mustn't threaten the state. It's the same thing in slightly more radical sounding words, but it means the same. And we have to develop a tendency in the world which says, yes, we actually do have to take power, and we have to think through what that means.
Okay, I mean, I wasn't planning to talk because I thought the discussion was more general about revolutions in the latest phase, but I was living in Venezuela for 7 months, 2 years ago, and just wanted to come in on the question of kind of power from below. The first weekend I was there, I was staying with a family's friend, and the mother said to us, we haven't got any water in the house because we've got a corrupt local water manager, and he's basically cut off the water, so we have to pay him money in order to have the water connected, and we're going to go and kidnap the security guards in the water depot down the road. Are you coming? And it was one of these questions where, well, revolutionaries shouldn't stand aside from the class, so we had to say yes, even though we were kind of a bit nervous about what this meant. And we went and we kidnapped this guy. I mean, we left him in the office, but we basically surrounded him, wouldn't let him leave, and had to make him phone this manager to come down and reconnect the water, which they did. And what was quite exciting was that when you talk to these local neighbours, it was quite clear that these weren't the most radical, members of Caracan society. These were people actually often, some of them identified with the opposition actually, some of them were quite apolitical, and we started, I kind of said, well, how did you organise this? Do you have a neighbourhood organisation or something? And then one of them said, no, we haven't. And the other one said, well, why don't we set up what is it called? A comuna, yeah? A commune, yeah? Because actually the Chavez government have been giving lots of money, I mean, large amounts of money, to neighbours who have an assembly of a certain amount of people, about 100 people, and that officially decide that they are a local commune, and they're going to run their local area. And officially, they have more power than even the local mayor over decisions. Now, in practice, that doesn't work out. There's all sorts of battles, all sorts of kind of manipulations. Also, they give more money to the comunas, which are more pro-government. There's all, there's all kinds of problems with it. But I was just wondering, you were saying that there's kind of no local democracy and, no real popular power in Venezuela. Can you just be a bit more specific about it? Because that seemed to me that there were still some kind of organs which actually did give people a voice and did give people some kind of control over their local area. So I'm just wondering, and that was 2 years ago, maybe things have changed. The other question I want to come back on is on why, if Chavez dies, power is going to be handed over to the worst bureaucrats in this government. The guy that they're talking about is Diosdado Cabello. And it's amazing, when you talk to any Chavista, it's almost like using the name Peter Mandelson here. He's really hated, utterly hated. People call him a kind of right-winger who's managed to get inside the government. Now, I think one of the reasons why Chavez is making such a crass mistake is that there's this kind of really false idea on the international level that the coup attempt in 2002 was defeated, one by the people who rose up and stopped the coup attempt, but also by the army, who rose up and managed to kind of defend, Chavez, who's of course a military officer himself. There's this argument of the kind of army and the people rose together. And I think that Chavez has always had a policy of trying to keep the army on board. and avoid any kind of conflict with it, because the understanding is that we need the army to be supporting our state, if we're going to get anywhere. And of course, Dios Dado Cabello is a younger army officer who has enormous influence in a whole layer, particularly middle layers of the army, who and I think there's this horrible kind of real politics where they kind of do deals and give each other kind of shares of power. And I think that's one of the weaknesses which explains this absolutely crazy decision, because Diosdado Cabello would absolutely kill the revolution. I mean, absolutely, whatever's left of it. Just one last point. In Spain at the moment, there's a massive crisis, and one of the things people are saying is that we're seeing a Latin Americanization of the peripheral European countries, and this comment is used again and again. And you can see a lot of the things you described about the kind of collapse of the major parties, these enormous economic and social crises, politicisation, new movements coming up, new parties. We've seen Syriza make this enormous, advance in Greece. And actually, one thing I would say is that I think in these struggles, the working class is a major actor. And you can see, particularly in Greece, how, we could see organs of working class power in the next few years if this crisis develops. Certainly people are starting to occupy their workplaces and run them themselves. And, so I think maybe in answer to the question earlier on about the nature of revolution today, I think it also depends on the kind of socio-economic fabric of each context. And clearly, if there is the kind of deepening of the crisis in the south of Europe, I don't think we're just going to see organs of popular expression which are based on kind of neighbourhood associations or in the countryside. We're going to see workers' Soviets as well.
I kind of specialise in really naive questions, and there's a bunch more. I can't possibly follow the last speaker. Well, first of all, what he did say, though, sounded terribly like what the comrade from Egypt was talking about yesterday, surrounding the water company and demanding water, except this time they kidnapped them. Which is probably why you're having this conference, because you're pulling together the world and analysing it. But I want to ask about 3 naive questions. I mean, I know they're terribly naive. Al Jazeera is now live on Freeview in England for the first time ever in the daytime. So on Wednesday, when it started, I turned down the set to see the morning news, as comparison to the dribble you get about the royals here with the BBC. And the second thing they had on was an enormous demonstration of Bolivian tin miners demonstrating. And it said that they had been on strike for I don't know how long, but a long time. And they were huge. There was a huge number of people. And unlike anything in British or American television, they actually seemed to be interviewing some of them. And one of them was saying, translated of course, that the state nationalized us, if I get it right, but they're not paying us anything, that we're casual labor, that we don't have contracts, and what we're fighting for is a contract. Maybe I'm stupid, but this seems to go against what you were saying about Bolivia. It was like the miners had this great, they were defeated, that they haven't disappeared. Presumably they're still extracting all this tin, and there is a working class, maybe that huge number. The second question follows on from what the speaker before last said. He seemed to be saying, Colin Barker seemed to be saying, that you have to look to the public sector workers, that the world working class has changed. Public sector workers are incredibly important, and teachers, doctors, But what about China? If anything, it seems like in the Far East, the pressures that were in the 19th century building capitalism have exacerbated, and there are huge places, whole cities that are economic zones, with mass numbers of very bad conditions of enormous numbers of people. So surely some of this goes counter his argument, or maybe, like I said, these are really naive questions. I'm just going to ask the third naive question and go away. It's a bit worrying what you're saying about the fact that there were these heroic, incredible upsurges in these places that end with the governments taking over, who sell out their people, basically, to international finance capital. Please, have you got anybody arguing your politics there? Is there anybody arguing against this, you know, the tendency, whatever you want to call it, or not?
Well, this is a response to being gently and pleasantly provoked by Colin Barker, I suppose, which is about whether there really is a transformation of the revolutionary subject in this situation. And maybe that is the debate of the next bit to come, but I just want to run at my own flag for later. And that is, I'm not convinced by it. I'm convinced there's changes, and that the 1930s and the 1980s are different to today. I'm much less convinced about this idea that the big workplace days are over, or that this has huge implications for the forms of workers' power that will result. If you think about the European experience at the moment, is the public sector workers in general in big employers that are at the centre of the revolt. Maybe that's just a European thing. If you remember Marikana Miners, the Marikana Mine Complex employs 28,000 people. It's hardly a small workplace. The South African Revolution will definitely include representatives of the Marikana miners as a centrepiece of what goes on. If you think of the Egyptian example, the key strikes that are the crucial factor in bringing down Mubarak are not in small workplaces in general. They are in Mahalla, they are in the giant factories, they're in the Cairo bus workers. These are the crucial strikes that take place. And you think in Britain the development is actually for many workers into bigger employers. You don't want a small shopkeeper anymore, a small shop, you're employed by Tesco's or Sainsbury's. And one of the most significant strikes in recent times was at Britain's biggest workplace, Heathrow Airport. British Airways was a very important strike. So I'm not suggesting there haven't been changes, but I'm wondering whether the clearly very important developments around Alto and so on are exceptions rather than a global rule. And that's just my opening shots, I suppose, on that debate, but I think that's a very important understanding of where we're going, and I'm not quite so convinced that this is a global trend that we're looking at.
I want to follow on from Charlie, because I want to talk about the question of the revolutionary subject, democracy and small workplaces, because I recognise that, and I'm going to talk about it really from my own experience, because I don't know that much about Latin America, but I do think in terms of one of the things that has come up this weekend is the whole connection between democracy, the working class as a revolutionary subject, and revolution. And I think one of the things that we really have to work on reclaiming is the notion of the working class and democracy. Not just in the sense of democratic demands either, but I actually mean the democratic process. That we actually have to reclaim the notion that it is the self-emancipation of the working class which enables and enacts democracy, because that is at the heart of self-emancipation. You can't have self-emancipation without that. And I want to talk about that in relation to small workplaces, which I think can be just as democratic as big workplaces, because the big workplace can only be democratic if it is broken down into sections. That's, you know, you can't, if you have just a couple of people who are the leadership of a factory which is 10,000 or 20,000, that is not, as far as I'm concerned, democratic. And I want to try to explain what I mean by the democratic process by talking about, and this is very parochial, about my own experience as an NUT rep in a school where we led strike action and the process of how we did it. Because I think for all the years I've been a revolutionary, in terms of understanding the democratic process, but also the roots of reformism, the organisation of the strikes actually taught me more than I've consolidated what I've read and understood and learned about from other places. And what I mean by that is, in order for us to enable a strike to happen over democratic questions of wage cutting, extended exploitation in terms of our working hours and redundancies, we had to pull together the entire staff, so we had to get 2 unions together. And we had to have mass meetings. And we managed to have mass meetings of up to 100 people out of a staff of 200 before we went on strike, and we had mass meetings of that size whilst we were on strike.
And the question of the leadership, myself and the other reps are absolutely crucial to get setting that process in train, because we have the notion that you have mass meetings, you pull people together, you discuss and you debate stuff. And there's no question that when you're actually involved in the strike and you have mass meetings, and you involve people in there is a process which is triggered. It's an equalising process, because you suddenly get people, regardless of their pay and so on and so forth, you know, teachers and support workers and so forth together, who are suddenly debating together, and all the divisions begin to disappear. You get people voicing ideas and developing a confidence and holding you, I talk about myself as an MUT rep, to account. And it is a process which is fundamentally democratic. You have to organise it that way. There's no question, you know, revolutionaries have to organise it that way, otherwise it won't happen. But in the process of it happening, you begin to see how people go beyond where you are. You know, you can be conservative as a revolutionary. And that process can happen in the course of a strike, and you can see how democratic debate and accountability can happen in those circumstances. But as soon as you go back to work and you are under the impact of exploitation again, what happens is that people, in my workplace, people think that myself and the other reps, that we are wonderful, because they see us as the guarantee of their position inside the school. Now, it's a stage further than it was a year ago, because now people will actually speak up in the school and they'll argue with the head, which they wouldn't do. You know, a year ago, people would just leave it to the two reps. It has gone that much further in terms of increasing their confidence and confidence. But essentially, without the strike action and that democratic process, going back to exploitation, the reformist notion of that the leader does it for you kicks straight back in again. And that is why, for, you know, in terms of Marxism, that whole question of the raising of the democratic process can only be realised in the end of the day through the taking of class power, which enables people then to have a fundamental control over the whole productive process and the whole of society and the whole of life. Because without that, inexorably, once you are pushed back into once you're pushed back into work, the domination of the hierarchical structures of management back in place again actually makes it very, very difficult. And I think that is one of the key aspects of where the reformism of the notion that other people do it for you, as opposed to being a revolutionary subject and doing it for yourselves, that's how that then can create the space within which other forces can then take over what has been a very democratic process. I hope that isn't too muddled, but anyway.
Sorry, I've been provoked by the combination of Colin and Charlie, because I helped to get this particular hair running when I wrote an article in Socialist Worker in 2007, which speculated that El Alto might represent the model for dual power and Soviets for the 21st century. And I think I was both right and wrong. I was right in the sense that if you look at Jeff's book, the picture is very much the kind that I painted in that article, of small workplaces, very high levels of informal employment and self-employment, meaning that territorial-based forms of organisation were critical to mounting the struggle and so on and so forth. So that's a sense in which I think that El Alto represented a significant divergence from the pattern of mass workers' struggles of the 20th century. However, I think Charlie's right that the big workplace hasn't disappeared, and all the examples he gave confirm that. And therefore, one reason why I wanted to emphasise the extent to which I agree with Charlie is because I think I was misinterpreted in what I said yesterday as arguing that we were moved into a world of precarious labour where everything had changed and so on and so forth. What I would say, however, is that the combined effect of the defeat that the core sections of the industrial working class suffered in the neoliberal offensive centred on the 1980s, and of the continuous process of neoliberal restructuring that we've seen since then, has been massively to disorganise the organised working class as it had existed, and quite significantly to change the relations of power within it. One symptom of that is the much greater profile of public sector unionism than was true even a generation ago. And the case of Marikana, where we have this great industrial union centrally associated with the anti-apartheid struggle that sees its workers deserting it en masse, ends up in conflict with them, and so on and so forth, is an illustration of that process of disorganisation. And I think that poses they're very important questions, which I don't think we have necessarily the answers to, about how the effects of that process of disorganisation are going to be overcome, and therefore the precise profile of the working class movement that is in the process of reforming itself. So that's really what I was trying to argue yesterday, and I'll shut up now.
I don't know, I'm probably thinking aloud, and I'm not quite sure how this discussion started, because I wasn't in when Colin provoked Charlie, etc. So I wanted to just throw another thing into the mix, though, about the question of a form, what is going to be the form of the Soviets, because I have no disagreement really with what Charlie said about big workplaces still remaining extremely important, but maybe the thing that we need to think harder about or try and conceptualize better is the question of growing unemployment. And I think this is perhaps a bigger problem in a place like South Africa or Zimbabwe, where the working class has been not just disorganized, but in a case like Zimbabwe, actually at one point, in a very real sense, deindustrialized within the country, that actually people were forced to either leave the country for work, or people were reduced to growing vegetables in their backyard because of the collapse of a lot of local industry. And in a place like South Africa, where you've got 40% unemployment, it does bring in a whole different dynamic in terms of people who, for me, are very, very much part of the proletariat, but a section of the proletariat that may never, it is very much a labour reserve, in the sense that if there's a sudden expansion in industry, they'll be pulled in, and they're in that sense being kept in reserve, or rather being left to make their own plan as long as capital doesn't need them. But are people who may never work in their lives, for all we know, if the current kind of economic decline continues. And so I think there is a question of thinking about how does this section of the proletariat link up with the big workplaces, and what form that's going to take, in a way that, in one sense I want to say to myself, it's not a new problem, because we've seen, the Russian Revolution had the peasantry and the proletariat, but it's a little different from that, in the sense that it's not a layer of people who've got an alternate way of making a living, but who actually have no way except for work or not working. So in that sense, unemployed it's not that they have alternate things. And that this does bring in, it's, for me, a superficial divide into the proletariat, but still one that is very real in people's daily experience, between a person who is in work, or, for example, the kind of experience that we've seen in a number of strikes of casual workers going on strike, and having unemployed people saying, what are they complaining about, at least they've got a job. So it does introduce certain divisions. I don't want to overemphasize it, because of course there's a very large middle ground where at a household level people are joined together, where it's the employed person, the unemployed person relies on the employed person. But I think there is this question about how how actually, especially if the trend towards joblessness continues, what is going to be the implication. And I think, one of the things about Americana is it showed a certain potential for that divide to just very suddenly be broken down, where there had been one before. Just the experience of the massacre suddenly galvanized a unity that crossed that boundary completely and crossed it, but not on the basis of a common demand over wages, but on the basis of a common outrage about the way people were being treated. But I suppose it also emphasizes the importance of politics, that we can't just rely on people's daily experience of life necessarily to show that a person who's unemployed and a person who's a wage worker share a common fate in relation to capitalism. It doesn't automatically just emerge from the experience of living in capitalism. So I suppose one of the things I have to say about it is that we do have to emphasize that we need more than just the experience of struggle, but also political analysis and an analysis of capitalism and of class too. But maybe people can continue. Thanks.
Yeah, just to turn very briefly back to Bolivia and South America and the example that Conway mentioned about the strike very recently, about 3 or 4 days ago, in the Bolivian tin mining industry. I was under the impression that it was actually not a conflict between the government and the workers in the tin mine, but actually between the National Union miners in Bolivia and the ununionized, cooperative, organised miners who are not part of the union and not employed by the government. In fact, the clashes that left one person dead, I believe, in the tin mines is actually workers fighting workers, in that both the unionised miners are fighting the ununionised miners, often who are not allowed to join the mines, including child miners. There's a very good documentary recently that just on those following 2 young miners, ununionised. But I'd like to maybe eke out what's behind that struggle. I was under the impression that both the unionised miners actually were complaining about lack of investment. There's been no investment in the tin mining for many, many decades. Most of the miners, including unionised and ununionised, get terrible diseases like silicosis, where there's silica in the mine infects your lungs and makes you die by 40. So both unionised and ununionised miners both have a terrible time. And how is the movement able to unite the working class together in a common struggle, or are those divisions very deep? Yeah, thank you.
Right, extractive capitalism. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the model is extractive capitalism plus intensive industrialized agriculture, largely soy and sugar beets, sugar cane, and so on for bioethanol. The extractive development is undoubtedly driven, not entirely, but very, very importantly by the Chinese boom. There's no question about that, and I don't know what the effects will be in the medium term. At the moment, that's going on, and that boom, oil and mining, is providing, for example, in Venezuela and elsewhere. Anne asked about where the resources are coming from, if there's redistribution of income. I think it's a very important question. I don't think there's redistribution of income. In other words, there's no evidence that the rich are getting poorer at the expense of that poverty is, that poverty levels are falling because a significant proportion of wealth is being taken from the wealthy. I don't think that's the case. What has happened is that the royalties and taxes on oil production have risen, and that has allowed the states to provide to raise the levels of social spending on programs of social welfare. That's certainly the case. Certainly in Venezuela, despite the rhetoric, there is what they call a section of popular capitalism anyway. One of whom, inexplicably for me, is neither popular and he's certainly a capitalist, which is Gustavo Cisneros, probably one of the 2 or 3 significant, most wealthiest capitalists in Venezuela, who is hand in hand with the Chavez regime, and no criticism is directed towards him. And that's true of several other very key sectors. But so in a sense, there is redistribution of the surplus, of a rising surplus from oil production. So oil production provides that, and allows the poverty levels, explains why the poverty levels which reach such disastrous proportions in Venezuela as well as in Bolivia in the mid-90s have been significantly alleviated, and why those in poverty, the numbers have reduced from I think at its height was 60% of the population, is now estimated at around 24% and falling. So that's happening, and that's directly from the profits from oil. Of course, and largely the oil price has kept very high during this period, so it's allowed this to happen. But when we talk about the working class, it's quite clear that the most concentrated bodies of workers are precisely in the oil industry, and in some related industries like iron and steel and aluminium and so on. Although in the case of aluminium, the aluminium factories, Alcázar down in Guyana, was a very, very important centre politically and in terms of organisation. But many of those working there are now no longer employed by the enterprise, but are in fact working as cooperatives within the factory, which undermines and disperses and in a sense subverts the traditions which have arisen in that factory too. The same is true of the major iron and steel complex at Puerto Ordaz. That's also now a small group of permanent waged workers and a significant number of contract and or cooperative workers, and many of the conflicts in recent years there have been between those sections of workers. I have to say often certainly not discouraged by local politicians or indeed by the state. The attitude of Chavez towards the organised working class has been hostile, has been destructive, and there have been, as we know, there were several attempts to create an independent union. This was about 7 years ago, the UNT. That has been undermined in all sorts of ways by the co-optation of some of its leaders, by public denunciations of some of the leaders as counter-revolutionaries and the rest, and that has isolated the working class from those forces who identify first and foremost with Chavez. So, in a sense, that the political argument about the connection between, community organisation, grassroots organisation, the organisation in the poor areas, the small-scale production and so on, and the traditions of worker struggle, that a gulf has been driven between them. I think, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but quite deliberately and systematically. On the question of the critical question, I suppose, in Bolivia, and I'm sure Jeff will come back on it too, is why was the MAS able to arrive out of nowhere and bind the movement so quickly to itself? I think my sense, and Jeff may well disagree, my sense of it is in the first instance by recruiting Morales as their representative and their presidential candidate, who had a very, very high profile at the heart of those struggles. That was a significant coup. And once in power, then the resources of the state were used to build a relationship through the same kind of state spending on key welfare projects and so on. And that bound the movements from below successfully to the state and to MAS and through via Morales, and that explains the very dramatic increase in the vote at the second election. Something else about the construction of a regional bloc. I mean, there are several regional blocs going on around the place. There's Mercosur, there's CELAC, the new one, there's ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance. How we see those? Well, the rhetoric says that these are organizations of international solidarity, of support for social programs and for radical projects. I think we can very easily see them in a quite different light as the creation of powerful blocs, capitalist blocs, to negotiate in the world market from a stronger position. And the fact that these blocs include Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela is testimony to that. I mean, after all, Brazil is not, for a while, I mean, Dilma Rousseff isn't really even pretending to be anything other than the major capitalist power in the region, investing on a huge scale, the largest agricultural enterprise corporation in the region is the Maggi Corporation, which is Brazilian. The invasions into the recent events in Paraguay, for example, have a significant amount to do with Brazilian interests working there, both to appropriate the water and to extend and expand the already massive kind of soya plantations and so on in the area. So those blocks are described in one way, but their actual function is mutual support and collective negotiation in the forums in the economic forums of world capital, I think, and the evidence is increasingly there to reinforce that. That there is some exchange of knowledge and technology is undoubted. There are doctors and Cuban medical personnel and teachers in Bolivia and so on. But I have to say that the real function of these regional initiatives is to strengthen the negotiating position of these powers in their negotiation with China, with Iran, with Russia, and so on. That's how I see it, and really to create a different multipolar set of relationships, which breaks the relationship or the dependence or the monopoly position that was occupied by the United States. I think that's clear. On the question of the one more thing. The working class. I think I'm aware, I'm very conscious of the fact that although we were discussing these examples, Mexico is critical. And Mexico is critical in two ways. One, because the role of the PRD reinforces what we've just been talking about as regards the mass and so on, its ability to appropriate the mass movement from below. The other is that this is an area of massive, concentrated workforces. So in Colombia, the combative organizations have been public sector workers, teachers, and so on, many of whose leading militants have been murdered. And in the countryside, in Venezuela, I think the key sector is probably the oil workers, who at the moment are absolutely central to and utterly controlled by the state. But nevertheless, this is a high concentration, a very significant number of workers at the center of the economy. Whether these can become key actors. Anyway, there's hundreds of things, but we'll just leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll just try and say a few words about four things that came up. The first one, I'm hardly going to resolve the question of the revolutionary subject in 2 minutes, but I think linking it to themes that were brought up over the course of the weekend, I think we can think about it at least through the notion of the working class, the primacy of politics and uneven and combined development, three things that ran throughout most people's discussions. And I think to begin with the working class, I think we need to find some way to navigate between generalized statements and universal claims and an attentiveness to specificity of specific social formations, and we can do that through the primacy of politics and understanding uneven and combined development. Because I don't think we can make general statements about, for example, the concentration of laborers in large workplaces. That does obviously still occur in very many places of the world, but in other places you see a very different transformation of the work process. And it's not that the working class doesn't exist in one place and exists only in large workforces, but rather takes very different forms and therefore calls for very different forms of politics in terms of organizing. But ultimately, yes, I think the working class is still a revolutionary subject that we take seriously. In Latin America, I think if you look at the plurality of the ways of different parts of the working class that led these movements in recent years, and here I'm thinking about the working class in a very large conceptualization. That is, anyone whose labor is partially commodified in some ways, who has to sell their ability to labor for parts of their lives, and who simultaneously doesn't live off the labor of others. So that describes a great many different forms of labor. And I think it's necessary to have that conception to understand contemporary capitalism in Latin America and probably the world, but I'm only going to talk about Latin America. And so in Argentina, at the most explosive height of things, you saw very recently unemployed workers leading that movement through the Picotero movements blocking off roads and the seizure of closing down factories. But they used their experiences of organizing in unions only years earlier and forming rank-and-file militant parts of those unions that were then collapsing into organizing in new forms. In the case of Ecuador, you see, and I think this is underestimated by some Marxist analysis thus far, in the Ecuadorian case and also in the Bolivian case, but in Ecuador you saw the question of indigenous liberation and the subject of indigenous liberation against colonial forms of power inside of the Ecuadorian social formation as absolutely central to that, and the ways of organizing inside of communal land holdings based on indigenous traditions of struggle, which have placed that movement principally against the most dramatic frontiers of capitalist expansion through the mining industry today. There's no other more militant confrontation directly with extractive capital than indigenous liberation movements today in Ecuador. And obviously the alliances that they need to build with the urban working classes will be central to any long-term objective, but we need to be attentive to that particularity. One general statement about Latin America too is that over this commodities boom that we've seen since 2002, driven, as many people in the question and answer period have talked about, the dynamism, however fragile, of China's growth, is that you've seen not a heightening industrialization of Latin America at the same time as you've seen rapid growth, but rather a relative deindustrialization and a return to basic commodity exports. So the rise of mining minerals, natural gas, and oil, and agro-industrial products, principally soya, and different regions, and the decline in different places of the auto industry and other sectors, and the movement of those industries to different places. How many minutes was that? Okay, so okay. So a couple things on Bolivia, the different forms that still on the revolutionary subject, the different forms that it took, varies even within the Bolivian context at the different moments, the key moments of the revolutionary epic of 2000-2005. So in Cochabamba, I think it was a different actor that was central than what happened in La Paz al Alto, the key area of the major gas wars. In Cochabamba, it was the Federation of Factory Workers that led what became the coordinator of a much larger branch of movements. But that required a question of politics within the Federation of Factory Workers, which recognized a massive transformation in the world of work in Bolivia into precisely small units of production, which is not the same to say that these are small businesses. Rather, you have single multinational corporations with 25, 30 outlets with under 20 employees working in them. And they don't often even know that they're related to each other or the relationship to the corporation because they all go under different subsidiary names. And it's very difficult to trace all of these things. But, and it's also illegal to unionize under 20 workplaces under 20 employees inside of Bolivia. So you can imagine the barriers to a simple call to organize at the point of production in those circumstances. And what happened, the Federation of Factory Workers who were uniquely situated in larger workplaces was that they reached out to these other layers of the working class and saw them as part of the working class. And that is what allowed for the massive explosion in Cochabamba, under a theme that united the working class, which was the privatization of water, which was hitting the most marginalized sectors of the working class in their communities. But the working class, of course, the point of production is important, but it doesn't end there. You also organize the working class inside of the places you live and your communities that you're associated in. In the question of El Alto, it was the Federation of Neighborhood Councils that was massively important in leading this, but it was also their alliances with the much diminished but still important, people are right to point out, the Federation of Mine Workers, and the teachers were critical in that situation. And it was brought up the question of Oaxaca in Mexico. Also in that case, it was the public teachers, mainly women teachers, who led that movement there. So I think it's difficult. I mean, once you look at any case, it becomes quite complicated who are or could be the leading forces at play. 2 minutes?
That's a second.
Okay. I'll try and take two things in 30 seconds. One of them is the question of the primacy of politics that was raised, and Alex mentioned that he had yet to have a satisfactory response to his question about why the movement towards socialism was able to contain the effervescence of struggle that we saw in Bolivia. And I think there's no easy answer to that, but one of it I tried to explain, however unsatisfactorily, was the changing class composition of the party itself. Because the party historically, I mean, I won't repeat myself, but because I mentioned what changed, but that earlier incarnation of the mass gave it a certain credibility as part of the struggle, even if in the early 2000s, even if in 2003, 2005, it failed to actually participate, or its leadership to take a leading role inside of the movement, and had opted for a very different programmatic platform. And just to clarify something that Mike brought up, it wasn't the selection of Evo Morales, who had been the leader of the movement from the very leader of the party since its foundation, but the selection of the vice president, Alto Garcia Linera, who had never been a member of the party, which was a precise idea of combating the racism inside of the middle classes against electing what the news was saying that it was an illiterate Indian to lead the country. We could never live in a country like that. So we need a bibliophile, former Marxist who's reformed his ways, who's white, to sort of moderate the profile of the government. Really the last thing is the regional question, because I think what's important to understand is massively the role of Brazil in all of this, because Brazil, I mean, is starting to recirculate in terms of Marxist debates inside of Latin America, the idea of Brazil as a sub-imperial power. That's to say, a power that in certain instances comes up against the imperial interests of US and other capitals and states, and at other times is able to negotiate with them. It's not a proper imperial power because it can't project power outside of its own region. But within South America, Brazil and Brazilian capital acts in a disciplinary way to all of its neighbors. For a while, I think Venezuela represented, and here I might disagree with some of the commentary, there was a moment in which we ought to have been more hopeful about the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, or ALBA. Obviously, it was not a socialist alliance of states as it was characterized, but no regional project is going to be instantaneously a socialist project. And I think ALBA in its initiative and the Bank of the South and so on at least had a transitional component to it when it was originally formulated. And it was specifically formulated against the free trade area of the Americas, which made it anti-imperialist. It has since become something very different and basically doesn't exist anymore. And it never really got off the ground. But I think there was contending projects between the Venezuelan-led South America and the Brazilian-led South America, which Brazil has won, and the center-left has been able to accommodate these movements more than any other section of the left inside of Latin America, because so long as this commodity boom persists, you're able to have certain redistribution of wealth without any serious confrontation with expropriating capitalists, because you have new state revenues even without raising taxes or anything through this natural resource skimming the rents. But that is obviously contingent. If you look at the last 500 years of Latin American history, this tends not to last.